I was 9 years old the first time I understood that my mother's love was a performance she gave for audiences and withdrew in private. And I understood it not because someone explained it to me, but because I lived it the way you live weather. Constantly, without choice, adjusting my entire self to whatever the atmosphere required that day. And the day I understood it was a Sunday in late October when my cousin Hannah came to visit with her mother and my mother. Transformed in the doorway, became warm and expansive and laughing, touching Hannah's hair and calling her beautiful and asking about her school and her friends and her everything. And I stood 3 feet behind this version of my mother and watched her be the mother I had been quietly starving for. And when Hannah and her mother left and the door closed, my mother walked past me to the kitchen without a word, without touching my hair, without asking about my anything. And I stood in the hallway for a long moment trying to understand the mathematics of what I had just witnessed. Trying to calculate what Hannah had that I did not. What equation she satisfied that I kept failing. And I could not find the answer because the answer was not findable by a 9-year-old. The answer was that my mother had never learned to love without a mirror, had never learned to give affection that wasn't also somehow a statement to the room, and I was not a room. I was just her daughter, present and unremarkable, and therefore invisible in the way that furniture is invisible, noticed only when it is inconvenient. The panic attacks came when I was 11, though I did not call them that. I called them the chest thing, the breathing problem. The moments when my body decided to stage its own emergency in the absence of anyone else declaring one. And they came most reliably on the evenings before school events where my mother would be present in the audience. Because her presence in an audience meant I would spend the entire event monitoring her face instead of living in my own experience. Scanning for approval the way a sailor scans for shore, desperate and not entirely sure what I would do if I found it. My name is Lena, and I was the kind of child that teachers described as sensitive, which is what adults say when they mean that a child feels things at a volume that makes other people uncomfortable, and sensitivity in our house was treated as a design flaw. Something to be corrected or at minimum managed quietly, and so I managed it quietly. I managed the chest thing and the breathing problem and the hunger for a mother who would look at me the way she looked at Hannah, and I managed it by becoming very good at performance myself by learning to wear fine the way my mother wore warmth as a thing you put on for company. My sister Reem was 7 years younger than me, which meant that by the time she was 9 and I was 16, I had spent years watching my mother make different choices with her, softer choices, more present choices, and for a long time I told myself this was because Reem was younger and needed more. And then I got older and stopped lying to myself and understood that my mother had simply changed. Not because of Reem's age, but because of some internal shift I had not been present for. Some moment when she had decided to try differently. And the grief of that was a specific kind of grief that does not have a clean name, the grief of watching someone become capable of the thing they withheld from you. The grief of being the child who arrived before your parent figured out how to show up. I left home at 18 for university in another city, and I breathed for the first time in years, not the careful counted breathing of the chest thing, but real breathing, automatic and unmonitored, and I built a life in that city that was entirely mine, friends who knew me. Without the context of my mother's opinion of me, a small apartment where nothing was arranged by anyone else's preferences, a self that was slowly, cautiously, becoming legible to me. The panic attacks did not stop immediately when I left home. They followed me the way patterns follow you until you turn and face them. But they became less frequent, less violent. And eventually I found a therapist named Dr. Samira, who had very calm hands and a way of sitting with silence that made silence feel safe instead of threatening. And in her office over the course of 2 years, I slowly dismantled the architecture of my own diminishment, brick by careful brick, learning to identify the places where I had internalized my mother's assessment of me, where I had taken her inattention and translated it into a verdict on my worth rather than a limitation of her capacity. The recording happened by accident, which is the most honest thing I can say about it. It was not planned, it was not strategic, it was a Sunday afternoon 3 years before my wedding when I was 26 and home for a visit, and I had set my phone on the kitchen counter to play music, while I helped prepare lunch and my phone was still recording a voice memo. I had started and forgotten, and my mother said the things she said in that kitchen while we prepared lunch. The comparison to my cousin Mira, who had just gotten engaged to someone impressive, the comment about how Lena always did things the complicated way, the observation delivered to the cutting board rather than to my face that she sometimes wondered if I would ever figure out how to be easier. And I did not react visibly because I had 26 years of practice not reacting visibly. And I helped finish the lunch and ate it and drove home, and it was not until that evening that I picked up my phone and saw the recording still running and stopped it and sat down on my kitchen floor and listened to 40 minutes of my own Sunday afternoon and heard my mother's voice saying the things she said and heard my own voice responding in the careful measured tones of a person who has learned to take up very little space, and I sat on that floor for a long time. I did not plan to play it at the wedding. I want to be clear about that because the version of this story where it was calculated and deliberate is a different and simpler story than the true one. What happened was that I spent the 3 years between that recording and my wedding in a different kind of internal negotiation. A slow and painful process of deciding what I wanted my life to look like, what I was willing to carry forward, and what I was finally, at 29, prepared to set down. And part of that process involved several very honest conversations with my mother that went better than I expected and worse than I hoped. Conversations in which I said true things, and she heard some of them and deflected others and occasionally briefly showed me a version of herself that was capable of sitting with discomfort, instead of immediately performing her way out of it. The wedding was in September, my husband Tariq beside me, 200 people in a garden full of evening light, and we had asked various family members to say a few words, and when it was my mother's turn, she stood and she spoke about me with a warmth and specificity that made people cry. She talked about my stubbornness as though it were a virtue. She called me her most honest daughter. She said that watching me become who I was had been one of the privileges of her life. And I sat at that table and I listened and I felt something very complicated move through me. Because the words were true, she meant them, I could hear that she meant them, and they were also 20 years late, and both of those things were simultaneously true in a way that my body registered as a kind of ache. After the speeches, after dinner, after the dancing had begun and the evening had loosened into warmth and noise, I found my mother at a table near the edge of the garden, and I sat down next to her and I took out my phone and I said, "I want to play you something," and she looked at me with an expression I could not read. And I played her 45 seconds of that Sunday afternoon 3 years ago, her voice saying the things she had said over the cutting board while I stood next to her not reacting, and when I stopped the recording the garden was loud around us and my mother was very quiet, and she said, "Is that how I sounded?" And I said, "That is how you sounded." And she looked at her hands for a long moment, and then she looked at me and she said, "I'm sorry, Lena, I am genuinely sorry, and I want to tell you that the apology fixed everything," because that would be a satisfying end to this story, but the truth is more complicated and more real, which is that the apology landed in me the way rain lands on very dry ground, absorbed immediately, needed desperately, and still not quite enough to make up for all the years of drought, and I held her hand. Anyway, my mother's hand at my wedding in the evening light, and I said, "I know," and I let it be what it was. Imperfect and real in ours. Because that is what this relationship has always been, and I have finally, at 29 with a husband and a life that is wholly mine, made peace with the fact that imperfect and real is still something, is not nothing, is in fact the only version of love that has ever truly existed between people who are both trying and both failing and both, on the better days, willing to sit in a garden and listen.